Hello, and welcome to another episode of RegenMigrants. Today I'm joined by Christiane, and I will be butchering her name, so I'll let her pronounce it for you afterwards as well. And I'm really, really excited to have you on the podcast today because you were another one that was recommended to me. So you should definitely speak to this person because this person has experience in working in regeneration, has so many experiences in different areas. So I'm very excited to have you today on the podcast. Thank you for your time previously as well. And I also really enjoyed just letting you introduce yourself. So I'd love for you to maybe talk a bit more about who you are, where you're coming from, and your connections with regeneration.
Thank you very much, Lola, for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today for this conversation, and it's great to see more and more people actually getting interested in regenerative development and regenerative design and what a regenerative culture could be. And discussing this in the context of migration, I find really, really interesting. So I'm working mostly in the field of forestry and construction with organizations, often NGOs or government agencies, and of course, all of the people in the different supply chains as well. Asking myself how I can bring regenerative approaches there. And what's great to see is there's already lots of people working on it. Not everybody uses the word regenerative, but is still asking themselves the same question. So how did my journey start? Well, I was born in Saarland, which is a small part in Germany at the very western side, at the border with France and Luxembourg. And from there, it was kind of clear that for me, it's important, this connection with other cultures. So the French and Luxembourg culture were actually just a few kilometers away from where I grew up. And this longing for understanding other people and speaking their other languages was something that was born very early on. And then I very quickly realized when I did my studies in the north of Germany, that already within the same country, the culture was very different. I then went on after my degree to live in Switzerland for a while. And from there to Berlin, which for me was not exactly the same as Germany because there are so many other cultures and it ticks in its very own way. It's also a melting pot of very many cultures coming together, as is Zurich, where you have lots of people from many countries coming together and different languages being spoken. I then lived in the UK for almost 10 years and I'm now in France. And what I find interesting is that as part of my migration experience as somebody who grew up in the privileged setting of, a Western European country with a certain level of affluence, a certain imagination of what your life will look like in the future, it still is every time very humbling to see what the whole bureaucratic processes are that you need to go through when you arrive as a foreigner in the country already with a higher level of rights and its pain. And from there to imagine what it means for people who have to leave their countries and who are coming from countries that have not got these strong ties and the right to be in our countries. It just really brings home kind of what privilege I'm actually experiencing and how we should work on welcoming others. I guess we're coming onto that theme later in our conversation as well.
Yes, 100%. And I love that you started already talking about privilege. That's something we talk a lot about on this podcast, and we'll definitely dive into that part. But first, I'd really like to get into the regeneration part of your work because, as you mentioned, regenerative design and working with communities is something that we talked about in the past. I'd be very interested to hear from you. What are some key elements that you introduce when you're bringing in regenerative design into a community? Because that word or concept can seem very foreign or very new but the idea of regeneration in many different cultures and contexts have already existed for many, many years. So I'd love to hear from you how you bring in these elements that might be linked to the concept of regeneration and how you learn from the people that already live in that community as well.
So, I mean, first up, I think we need to clarify that there are really very different lineages or schools of thoughts around regeneration and what regenerative design or regenerative development is. And there's also regenerative leadership, very different question, but they're all interlinked. So personally, I quite like working with approaches lately, it's quite a recent thing, that really start by listening to the land. Actually really take into account the geology, the ecological habitat that is there, learning from the land, going back in history, quite a long way in history, trying to drill down what was there before humans actually arrived in this place. What did it look like? How did it function? What did it do without us? And what happened when humans came into that space? What did we contribute? How did we work with the land? How did that system work? And then really trace that all along to understand where this place is today, and then understand how this place functions. Place kind of as a combination of physical elements that are there and living beings that are there, and these are human and non-human living beings. So understanding that the culture behind it, the history, and then taking it from there to basically say, okay, if this is what was happening, so I understand what the trajectory of this community, if that's what I'm looking at, and then trying to find out what is the potential of this community. And if you're looking at a particular project, you need to understand what is actually the goal of this project. What are the objectives that the project owners are holding? And sort of where do they have their blinkers maybe? What are the blind spots in that? And how can we work together to open this up, to kind of change our perspective on things, our posture, and that will always require us to change the inner position that we are taking. And it means that I, as a project consultant or sometimes a project lead, I need to work on my inner position. I need to be clear what my perspective is, and therefore I also need to be very clear what my own worldview is, which brings us back to this Western privileged worldview, and to be really clear, that is how the lens I'm looking through, and how can I open up that lens. So one of the very key elements as well is with all of those regenerative approaches is that you are able to hold multiple truths and multiple realities and not pitch them against each other, but hold all of those at the same time and seek for some reconciliation. So in the lineage of the Regenerative Institute would talk about creative reconciliation, and those powers of something that is activating, driving stuff forward, and something that is restraining it, like a counterforce. How can you hold those two, and what creative reconciliation emerges from that? Being very clear that it's not me as a consultant or any of my colleagues in the project who are bringing that solution. We might have a great idea, an epiphany, but more like a coach being there and helping the community find their solution. And that is a very key point in regenerative development, because what we're trying to do is creating movement. We need to create capabilities of people in the community as a system itself, to keep evolving. So a perpetual seeking for regeneration, because that's the definition of regeneration. It's not something that stops. It keeps going. It keeps evolving. And therefore, we're looking at different maybe states of being. It's not like a project end. It's not something you can define on a spreadsheet or in sprint plans. And makes it so utterly difficult to integrate in our current ways of financing projects, planning projects, managing projects. So these are a few elements.
I really love that. And this idea that regeneration is something that continues, right? It's not, okay, I'm now a regenerative and that's the point. And I also really like this point that you bring in about all the beings, because we tend to forget about that. We tend to focus on the human beings and not all the other ones. And I would also be interested in hearing from the work that you've already done, or maybe case studies that you hear. What do you classify as a successful project then, if this is something that needs to be ever evolving, ever growing? What really makes it successful? How do you say, okay, that's a good performance mark? And how do you then transfer some of that knowledge to other projects?
So a good performance mark, if you like, is if you can see the community taking action themselves. Like there's an example of the French have something they call tiers-lieu, which is a third place, which is sort of a place that invites citizens in for very mixed activities, but it could include living there. It can include small businesses being located there. It kind of is a transversal kind of thing that crosses the different typical boundaries that you have. So if you look at that as a community hub, if you like. So there was a building project around renovating a building and then making it available for such a tiers-lieu. And so within the project, which wasn't done by myself, but by colleagues of mine, they basically said, well, we need somebody who facilitates those interactions. Can we not find somebody who's already in the community and who would be interested in doing that? And then we can help them, do a training courses to become a facilitator and convener and so on. So there was a person who was very interested in doing that. And now, 1.5 years later, while the building is still being renovated and retrofitted, they found another building just outside the village where she has created a hub and where she convenes and brings people together, and has already managed to bring together people who have been living all their life in the community and people who've only arrived over the last 3 to 5 years. And before, in that community, there was quite a rift between those. So people didn't necessarily want to do stuff together. And all of a sudden, you've got a new association where people are gardening together, and they're completely mixed between the new and the old residents of that particular place. So these are very small things that create ripple effects, because this is not the only project. There's loads and loads of things that are now being created around that, and where all of a sudden conversations can take place that didn't take place before. And I think that's something that shows success. You do something small, it creates bigger ripple effects, and its effects, its outcomes are much bigger than the actual project, which in this case would have been, let's just look at how we can get best building performance and use eco materials and all of those things. But the people in that project realized this is actually not it. This is just a conduit, its own vehicle to do something else, something that is much bigger, that will enable more projects. In the same community, there will be a building project around a new school. Again, that will be a vector for further activities, for thinking about mobility, for thinking about food, for thinking about all sorts of things. And that's what I would say is a key marker for a regenerative project, that it helps the community achieve something, change trajectory, if you like, achieve something that it would not have been able to achieve with the best will in the world. without that. Now that's difficult to measure.
Exactly. And while I'm sitting here, I'm also thinking about maybe some examples you might have of what regeneration projects can be. So you just said, okay, retrofitting a specific building, they're now gardening together. Are there some maybe classical examples that are maybe always first that come to mind that you try looking into when you're trying to implement it into a community, or the one that people naturally gravitate towards and want to do?
In terms of topics,
Exactly. Yeah.
I think conviviality
Hmm.
is a good start. It doesn't matter what it is, but if you bring people together around food and having a good time, that's always a good starting point. And actually talking with people from Regenesis, they said actually they spend an awful lot of time in most of their bigger projects to do exactly that. Invite people in around some good time together to facilitate those conversations, because what is essential in that work is trust. If you want to change the system, then the speed at which you can achieve that just is the speed of trust. And trust takes quite a bit of time, and it takes an awful lot of authenticity, honesty, transparency. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. And you never know when you arrive in a community how exactly it works, where there are rifts, where there are divisions, different cliques, where there are boundaries that are informal that you can't see. You don't know the history that people have with each other. And in a lot of places, in the end, everybody knows each other. In professional communities, you'll have the same. In the end, there's always a circle that comes round. So conviviality is definitely something to start with, trying to understand each other, trying to bring people together as humans, not as functions and in their roles, helps, especially with this authenticity. I found interesting this morning, I participated in a webinar, and I knew that there were government officials, there were all sorts of people from all sorts of different types of organizations and levels within those organizations. But as a participant, like myself, you didn't see any of that. All you could see in the chat were first names. So everybody was on the same level. And in essence, that's how we need to come together to overcome those boundaries and our Cartesian reflections and any notions of hierarchy, and who knows more and who knows what.
That's a fantastic point, and it draws really well into my next question, because talking about food, that's what you normally see when you travel, when you go abroad. The first thing you think about is definitely food. And how do you get people interested in more conviviality, especially in cultures that are very individualistic cultures, or that they prefer to maybe, oh, I'll see my family once every 2-3 months. How do you get those types of people to want to be in some type of co-living or thinking about a third place that I go to frequently? So maybe the next question I might have for you is really, how do we get people, one, interested in regeneration or this idea? And also, how do we get people interested in actually working on it, sometimes even voluntarily, without a lot of money coming into it, and in these projects that not only require money, but patience, working with people that aren't really exactly in the same field that you are, which is not what we commonly do. How has that best worked for you, or what do you still advise that we do?
Well, I personally have come to the conclusion that sort of when we start with the principle that we bring this approach to where we currently are, because that's probably where we're best, where our key and core competences are, and where we probably have the biggest level of influence. Again, back to this trust issue. And there's a level of respect. Because people know you're good at this, this, and this, so that's why they're being. You need to be and adopt a regenerative mindset, and that will change everything. And now that just sounds like the little power pill. And it isn't a power pill because it requires a lot of self-development as well. I'm not saying, do 3 years of self-development first before you have a conversation with your work colleagues around regeneration. No, do it all at the same time, because it's a lot of trial and error. And it requires quite a bit of courage to do things differently than what you have perceived is how it's done in your organization or in your work environment. So that's the first thing, really, how I show up and what I bring to the table, how I ask the question, how I tell the story without even ever using the word regenerative will have an effect and an impact. And there's a lot of people out there who are very willing to work on certain topics. And sometimes the key is more to make everybody understand, help everybody understand that everybody in that is equally passionate, and we often have little bun fights about the right solution to how to get there. So if we take that away, then we can focus on this common space of what we're passionate about and where we want to arrive at, and co-create the question we want to answer, and recognize as human beings through really deeper connections with each other that this is just sort of whether I like, playing with sand or playing with whatever earth, it's sort of, but it's not the essential bit. It's just because everybody is so passionate that we have these fights with each other. Maybe it could be something else, but basically coming together as humans and kind of understanding what it is that we all care for, that we have in common, is really key in all of that space, I would say.
That's interesting, and I liked how you said play, because what I've been learning a lot in that area, especially somebody coming from sustainability, is we need to think about ourselves sometimes a little bit like kids. So how do we talk about play in these spaces as well, and how do we understand our conviviality with each other and what culture looks like into it as well? And that also gets me to think about you. I'm living in Germany. I'm Brazilian. You're now living in France. You've also moved around a lot. How do you think that these regenerative concepts maybe are easier to embed in some cultures? And where have you maybe seen that they have been already really implemented and we can copy with pride, as an example?
That's a really good question, because I think one of the elements that everybody's struggling, or a lot of people are struggling a little bit, is this giving yourself permission to experiment. And that's difficult, often in a context of community projects where money is tight and your funders really want to see results and outputs. And you can't sell them a positive uncertainty. It's so having, creating that space to experiment would then naturally lead you to think that probably you can most easily implement regenerative approaches in cultures that do have a culture of play and experimentation. I don't know if that is true. So if you look at the UK, for instance, the UK has got a culture, British culture is one of innovation, really strong. You can just go and try something out and you can fail, and that's not a problem, and you launch the next thing. And that's why it's really super easy and very cheap to just start a business in the UK and close it again, whereas that's fundamentally different in France, in Germany, and in Switzerland. It's, much, much bigger hurdles, a lot of money involved, so very high risk for anyone who embarks on that journey. But at the same time, what I've seen is there is a very, very vibrant scene around regeneration in France and in construction that is now supported as well through latest French laws, which encourage to use natural materials. Again, then we need to think about not over exploiting them, but it is something you can work with. You're not permanently blocked out. Obviously, there is also a scene in the UK But the UK is equally a country that has bought into neoliberal approaches, so capitalism is king. But you do have, like a bioregional learning centre, for instance, in Devon, who are doing an awful lot of work. There are quite a few projects going on in Wales, lots of things as well in Scotland, and then all sorts of projects dotted around. So that's encouraging. There's plenty of projects in the Netherlands, which is not necessarily in line of what you see in the media around land use discussions in the Netherlands. There are several communities in Germany, despite its big bureaucracy and rigidity, that really interesting community projects who have received good funding. There's one project in the south of Germany as well, which is called Hofgut Leo, which is experimenting with a regenerative cooperative and the funding models behind that, and really working with the community around. So there are plenty of really interesting things happening. Spain, Portugal, really good projects and communities of regenerative change agents from different walks of life and professional backgrounds coming together. So I think it's popping up a bit everywhere in Europe at the moment.
That's cool. And I've been thinking a lot about this from Portugal perspective as well. I have some friends working there, but I've also have been made aware about people, especially Americans or from the United States, coming to Portugal and then buying land, and then the people that actually live there then don't have access to land, and things get a lot more expensive. And this idea of a nomad where you can go anywhere. So you want to go to places that are cheaper, but you're earning 3-4 times the salary. And that becomes harder for the people that actually live in that place. So in Europe, South America, and Asia, the conversations are similar. But I'd be curious for you as a kind of European that has been working so much in these projects around regeneration, thinking about these community concepts. Where do you see that we still need to have a conversation around migration and regeneration? And what does that mean, not only from Europeans moving south, but maybe people from the south moving to Europe? What do we still need to have a conversation on to make sure that we're doing it in the most regenerative way possible?
Well, I think we need to have conversations in all dimensions with regards to that. And I mean, migration, what does it even mean? What pictures do we have in our head? For me, there's migration of people who are just curious and just want to explore continents, but don't necessarily have any pressure to leave their home. They're in a completely different mindset and place, and and regardless of that, I would feel that sort of you should be able to call home and participate fully as a citizen with all citizen rights in any country you live, maybe beyond the 5th year you live there, because you're making a commitment, you're participating in this place. So why do we have our things with passports and borders and whatever, and nationalities? I know that sounds unbelievably naive to a lot of people, but yeah, it creates a lot of heartache and headache, all of this bureaucracy, because it also creates these ideas of division and that we're different from each other. In terms of regenerative development and design, Europe can learn an awful lot from projects in Latin America, notably, and also some projects happening in Asia and in Africa. And we never talk about those unless we do specific projects around eco villages or whatever, and then you're introduced to restorative ecosystem projects and whatever, and then you discover that these things have been going on for 20 odd years and longer, and governance questions, participatory budgets, and you can name loads and loads of different social innovations, for instance, that have all seen the light in Latin America and have been experimented with successfully, and we still don't. So that's one bit. The other bit is actually what's going on our planet, and we will see in the future with the massive pressure, so global warming and the loss of habitat, ecological habitat, that you will see a double migration of non-human species and humans. And they might come to very similar places because they will still be habitable, which means that spaces get more dense, which if you look at the origins of the COVID pandemic might mean more pandemics as well if you've got more stressed wildlife and more mutation and so on. So there's a whole different set of topics. So in essence, you've got people who are losing not only their livelihood, they're losing their home, the place they feel they belong to. So people suffer from trauma. All living beings who have to leave those places will suffer from trauma, just that we don't understand trauma that well for non-humans. So I think we in the Western world definitely, we will also see migration within Europe because of global warming. But we will really need to learn how to welcome people into our land, into our cultures, learn from their cultures, so that we actually can co-create habitable spaces for us all to thrive, human and non-human residents of this planet. And I think that's a massive conversation to be had, and actually not just a conversation. It requires doing, because I still believe that in that regenerative discourse, we get stuck in the discourse, in the conversation. We can have all sorts of really amazing intellectual conversations around the concepts, and there's great stuff out there on the internet that you can find, and you can participate in a webinar twice per day. But actually, it's in the doing that we're going to change things.
Like that. I like that very much. And you bring some really concepts as well, because when I was thinking about the name of the podcast, or what do I call it, I thought, okay, roots, or immigration. And then I was looking into, here in Bonn, there's a UN project on migration of birds. And I thought that fit in very well. Plus it rhymed, I have to say. But it really brought together this idea that we're not the only ones migrating. We definitely learned from the non-human beings on how to be migrating beings. And you brought a bunch of different great topics to the table. And like you said, I'd love to intellectualize with you and continue the conversation. But what I really want from this podcast is just to give people some things to think about, but also something to feel. And the last thing I would like to close this podcast with is, I'll say goodbye to people from here. Thank you so much for joining. But I'd love to hear from you a last sentence, if you were in front of a group of people, that you could maybe inspire them, or something you could share with them to get them to start thinking about regeneration, get them to start thinking about coming together as a community, actually doing things together, thinking about their food, their housing, their third place, if they have a third place at all. What would you say? And I can give you a minute to think about that. But how could we actually inspire people to get involved? But thank you so much for your time today and for jumping on the call. And interesting to hear what's on your mind.
So what I would say is, take a very deep breath, sense into yourself, and then try to image a place that you love. And from there, just let emerge thoughts of what you would like to contribute to this place, and how you could invite those around you into this place, for this place to keep evolving and being a thriving place that you all love and care about. Thank you very much, Lila. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.